Until last month, I had spent the past 3 years working as a property inspector for a national real estate firm. They managed over 500 homes across a 3-state region that I covered. My boss Willie and I were responsible for inspecting every single one of them, at least once every 2 months. This meant checking for leaks, signs of wear and tear, ensuring there were no issues with water or electrical systems if they were turned on, and making sure no one had broken into squat or vandalized the place. It wasn't a bad job, and although the role had been pitched as part security guard, part handyman, it really didn't demand much more than showing up, taking a few pictures, jotting down notes if something seemed out of place, and then reporting back to Willie. Simple tasks that we might handle ourselves, though anything too complex or dangerous would be handled by a specialist. As for squatters or trespassers, I never came across a single one in all my years on the job. Then, about 8 months ago, I went into a house that had just been added to our inspection rotation. This was pretty standard, as some properties lingered in a sort of limbo, neither sold nor rented. But there was enough turnover to bring new homes into the mix every 2 months or so. From the outside, this house didn't stand out much. It was a single-story ranch with weathered white vinyl siding, stretching farther back than you'd expect from the curb. To borrow one of Willie's favorite sayings, it had a real ass on it. The yard was in fairly decent condition, though I knew I'd be suggesting the landscapers come by more frequently before the property could be properly shown. A pressure wash would help the exterior too, but after a quick walk around the outside, I didn't spot any major issues or repairs to flag. So I went inside. Crossing the threshold of an empty home can evoke different sensations. Most are pretty unremarkable. Maybe the air feels a bit stale. Some houses are stiflingly warm or strangely cool, and you might catch a whiff of dust, mildew, or the unmistakable scent of rodent droppings. But when I stepped into this house, the air felt dense, as if I had stepped off the edge of a pool and was suddenly submerged, struggling to move through water. A jolt of panic hit me at the strange sensation, and I instinctively reached for the light switch, only to remember that the electricity hadn't been turned on yet. The house had been bought in a foreclosure auction, and it could be weeks or even months before the utilities were restored and the property was handed off to one of the company's agents. Muttering under my breath, I pulled out my flashlight and flicked it on. Though it was early afternoon outside, inside the house, it felt like dusk. Everything looked murky and gray, the beam from my flashlight weak and barely cutting through the shadowy corners. I shook off the creeping unease. I had long since gotten over the initial nerves that came with entering empty houses when I first started the job. There was no reason to get worked up now. If I found anything unusual, I could just call Willie and be done with it. No big deal. Starting down the front hall, I veered right. The room had dingy brown carpeting and plain yellow walls. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The house had 12 rooms according to my sheet, and I always worked my way from front to back. Before heading through the door, at the rear of that room, I crossed the hall to check the room on the left. Smaller, with the same brown carpet, green walls, and again, nothing noteworthy. I moved on to the next room, which should have been a larger living area. But as I stepped into the doorway, my flashlight caught something. It was an old rocking horse. Its wooden frame had black paint peeling off the rockers, and the plastic head, faded by age, still clearly resembled the snarling face of a black stallion. What stood out the most, though, was the saddle. The dark leather seat gleamed under my flashlight, looking far too well preserved compared to the rest of the horse. Embossed in golden letters above the left stirrup was a name, easily legible from where I stood. Nick's Best Steed. A knot tightened in my stomach. Something felt off. It wasn't unusual to find small bits of trash or odds and ends missed by the cleaners on a first pass. But how could they have overlooked something like this? Stepping back through the room and into the hallway, I instinctively reached for my notepad but stopped short. Normally, I'd jot things down as I came across them, but I didn't want to do that here. The thought of focusing on anything other than my surroundings made me uneasy, almost vulnerable. I hesitated, then forced myself to complete the thought. Vulnerable. Clenching my jaw, I moved further down the hallway. I knew I was being irrational, but it didn't matter. My nerves had gotten the better of me. All I needed was to finish a quick sweep of the house and get out. The fourth room? Empty. The 5th and 6th rooms were the same. But when I stepped into the 7th room, I found a television sitting in the middle of the floor. It was an old model, with a small curved screen made of thick glass and encased in a heavy wooden cabinet. How could they have left something like this behind? I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of fascination as I looked at it. It was definitely old, maybe even an antique, perhaps valuable to the right person, even if it didn't work. Crouching down, I turned the metal channel dial, which clicked satisfyingly between 1 and 9 with each twist. I swept my flashlight across the front, but something made me stop when the beam hit the screen. The glass had ridges in it, 6 lines trailing down, as if someone had dragged their fingers through clay. But these marks were different, as though something had melted its way into the glass. A shiver ran down my spine as my forgotten fear came rushing back, stronger now. It was probably nothing. Houses left behind strange things all the time, right? Still, I was ready to be done and out of there. I glanced around the room once more and moved on. Room 8? Clear. Room 9, the last on the right side of the house, had some peeling wallpaper, but no signs of mold or water damage behind it. I crossed the main hall into room 10, and at first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I turned to the corner and saw him. A naked man crouched there, grinning at me. In that first jolt of panic, I took him in completely. His head was crudely shaved, with wisps of hair clinging to a scalp mottled with cuts and scabs. His face was gaunt, except for his swollen, red-rimmed eyes. Even as he stretched his cracked lips into a grin, revealing 2 rows of gray teeth, tears streamed down his face, and his body shuddered with a sound that was somewhere between laughter and sobbing. Oh, fuck. Number no, no, no. The next thing I knew, I was sprinting for the front door. I didn't stop until I was outside, sitting in my car with the doors locked. That's when I called 911, trembling as I waited for the cops to come deal with the trespasser. It took half an hour for someone to arrive, and when they did, they looked skeptical. I'd made the mistake of telling the dispatcher that not only was there someone in the house, but he was naked and crying. I'd thought it might make them hurry, but instead, it only seemed to make them take me less seriously. Still, the officer was polite, asking me a few questions before telling me to wait outside while he checked the house. It was clear from his face that he didn't expect to find anything, and when he came back out, his expression confirmed it. I forced myself to ask if he'd seen the man. The officer frowned slightly. No sign of anyone in there. He gestured towards my car. You said you've been out here the whole time, right? Since you left the house? I nodded, and his frown deepened. Well, I didn't see any other way in or out, so unless he climbed out a window, I don't know where he could have gone. He let the implication hang in the air for a moment before shrugging. Still, if you have any more issues, give us a call and we'll send someone back out. I wanted to argue, to convince him I wasn't making it up, but what could I say? What difference would it make? I was done for now, and I figured Willie would know what to do next. He'd been doing this job for over 30 years and had seen it all. Where did you hear about it, kid? The internet? I stared at Willie, confused. We were sitting in Brecken's diner, our usual spot for breakfast and catching up on work, and I'd just finished telling him about the house and what had happened. I'd noticed his expression changing as I talked, but I assumed he was just concerned about what I'd seen. Now that I was done, though, he didn't just seem concerned. He looked tense, almost angry. What are you talking about? I asked. Willie took a sip of his coffee, watching me over the rim of the cup. Look, I'm not calling you a liar, but if this is some kind of prank, just tell me now. I won't be mad. Where'd you hear about the Hollow House? I blinked at him, completely lost. Willie, I have no idea what you're talking about, I swear. What's the Hollow House? Willie set his coffee down and sighed. I believe you, kid. You've always been straight with me, and I've never known you to bullshit. I just thought maybe you came across something on the internet. Seems like everything ends up there these days. He shrugged lightly. But the first time I learned about it was the same way you did, about 20, maybe 25 years ago. I went into a house that looked perfectly normal on the outside, and then I saw the TV. Back then, it wasn't as old as it would seem now, with everyone having flat screens on their walls, but even then it was strange that it had been left behind. My eyes widened. You mean you saw the I started, but Willie cut me a look that said I should wait until he was done explaining. I bit my tongue. He rubbed his eyebrow as he continued. Then I saw the rocking horse, just like you described. Nick's best steed and everything. I started to get jumpy, but I was quick to spook back then. Told myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together on the table. But then I saw the man. We didn't have cell phones back then, and the company encouraged us to be tough, to threaten people, scare them off if we could, not hurt anyone, but make it seem like we might. He shook his head, staring down into his coffee. The guy just stood there, staring at me, laughing and crying at the same time. His eyes were locked on mine while I got up in his face, yelling at him. Told him I'd get rough if I had to. Willie let out a bitter laugh. Meanwhile, I was trying not to piss myself. Then he looked up at me, his voice low and serious. That's when his eyes shifted, like he was looking at something behind me. I couldn't hold back any longer. What was it? What was behind you? Willie's face drained of color. No, I don't want to talk about that. He licked his lips, looking away. Anyway, I got out of there. Went straight to a buddy of mine who worked for the company and told him what I'd seen. Turns out he'd heard of it before too. That's when I first heard the name, the Hollow House. I frowned. Okay, but if you knew this place was messed up or haunted or whatever, why didn't you warn me before I went in there? Willie smiled a little and shook his head. No, you don't get it. It's not the same house. It's never the same house. Not on the outside, at least. Never in the same location. Never with the same past owners. Believe me, I've looked into it. And over the years, I've talked to half a dozen people who've run into it too. Every single one described seeing the same things inside. But the house itself? Always a different place, all across the country, over the last 30 or 40 years. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. How is that even possible? What is it? Willie spread his hands and shrugged, a deeper, resigned gesture this time. I have no clue, and I don't plan on finding out either. Leaning in, he lowered his voice. That's why, the couple of times I've run across it since, as soon as I recognize it, I get out. Fast. And from then on, that property gets my stamp of approval without me setting foot inside again. Just a quick drive-by to make sure it hasn't burned to the ground. He looked me dead in the eye. And that's exactly what you need to do too. I nodded, but I could already feel the unease twisting in my gut. I don't know, man. I can't afford to lose this job. Even if it's real, maybe it's just creepy, right? I mean, you never got hurt, and... I trailed off as Willie unbuttoned his sleeve and rolled it up. The first time I found the Hollow House, I left with this. Just above his elbow, the skin was scarred, dark and tough, like a shadow had been branded into his flesh. The scar was shaped like a hand, its fingers gripping his arm. He reached across the table and gripped my arm now, his eyes serious. It's not just a creepy story, kid. You got lucky this time. The 5 or 6 people I've talked to who ran into the Hollow House, I've heard at least a dozen other stories over the years about people who disappeared while doing this job. How many of them do you think went into one of these places and didn't get out in time? I was nodding now, terror sinking in. Maybe the fear in my eyes convinced him to make his offer. Look, I'll adjust our schedules, all right? Put that house on my rotation. I snapped out of my shock for a moment. Willie, you don't have to do that. But he was already raising a hand to stop me. No, really. I've dealt with this enough times to know the signs, and I can get out before anything happens. Besides, I'm not planning to set foot in that place. And after all these years, no one's going to question me if I don't report every little thing. He pointed at me, his tone firm. But don't think that means you can let your guard down. If you stick with this job long enough, you'll run across it again at some point. I sighed, feeling conflicted. Yeah, I hear you. But are you sure about this? When Willie looked at me this time, his eyes only held mine for a brief second before he glanced away. Yeah, kid. I'll be fine. For the next few months, things seemed to return to normal. I knew from the schedule that Willie had been back to the Hollow House twice, but he never brought it up, and I didn't either. I was relieved not to have to go there myself or risk faking my inspections, but I couldn't shake the guilt for passing the risk to him. Still, every time I entered a new house, there was a moment of tension and fear as I checked the air and scanned for anything unusual. Nothing ever was, but the anticipation never fully went away. That lingering fear, though, did make it easier to live with the guilt, especially since I was sure Willie wasn't actually stepping foot inside. Then, a new corporate policy came down from the national office. To ensure thorough inspections, we were required to take at least 3 interior photos of every house, one of which had to include the laminated property form. These forms were always taped to the kitchen counter, listing the house's address, property ID, and various details like square footage and the local agent's contact info. Since each form was unique to the house, it wasn't something we could just fake. The second I read that email, my stomach dropped. When I checked the schedule, I saw Willie was slated to inspect the Hollow House again in 2 weeks. I figured I'd talk to him at our usual breakfast meetup, and we could work out a solution. Or at least I could offer to take the house back. "No, kid. It's okay. I'll figure something out," he said when I brought it up. I frowned. I don't want to go in there either, but maybe I can fake the pictures. I could make a copy of the form and tape it to a different counter in another house. No one would ever know. He looked thoughtful for a moment, but then shook his head. "It won't work. Those forms aren't in any system we have access to, so we wouldn't know some of the details, like the local realtor, without actually seeing the form. And I know the way those corporate types think. They started using those forms 5 years ago, made a big deal about putting them in the same spot in every house. I wondered why at the time, but now? They probably took photos of them back then to catch anyone trying to fake it later on. That seems a little paranoid, don't you think?" Willie shrugged. "Maybe, but I wouldn't put it past them. Hell, it's smart if you think about it, just damned inconvenient." I sighed. "Well, I could go in and do it. It's probably not like that all the time, right? Otherwise, how would they ever set up the forms or sell these houses?" His eyes flicked up to meet mine. "I don't think they ever do sell them. I've kept tabs on the ones I've run into over the years, and they never seem to sell. They just disappear off the listings after a while. I don't know why, and I'm not interested in finding out." He nodded as he chewed, his gaze distant. "But you're right. It can't be bad in there every time. Maybe I'll get lucky. I'll take a ton of pictures of that damn form when I'm in there. Enough to last me until I retire." My stomach twisted as I asked the question I didn't want to. "Are you sure?" Willie hesitated, and in that brief pause, he looked frail, older than I'd ever seen him. When he spoke, his voice was steady but quiet, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, kid, I'm sure." The next time Willie was scheduled to inspect the Hollow House, I wanted to call him immediately afterward, but decided against it. We were meeting for breakfast the next day, and there was no point in making a bigger deal out of it than it already was. If something had happened, he would have told me. Unless he didn't make it out. The thought gnawed at me, growing louder the longer I ignored it. Finally, I gave in and called him that night. Each ring felt like it tightened a vice around my chest, making it harder to breathe. "What if?" "Hello?" "Willie, thank God," I blurted out, relief flooding through me. "I'm sorry. I just knew you had the house today and I wanted to make sure you were okay." "Huh? Oh yeah, it went fine," he replied, sounding distant. I sat down, still feeling the adrenaline in my veins. Good. So, you got the pictures you needed?" "It all went fine," he repeated. "I'm just real tired. Gonna beg off meeting you tomorrow if that's all right." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Something wasn't right. I frowned, feeling unsettled. Willie had never missed one of our breakfasts except for that one time when he was down with the flu for 2 weeks. "You sure, man? Need me to bring you anything?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. "No, I'll be fine. Thanks. Need to go now." Before I could say anything more, I heard the sharp click of the line disconnecting. I spent the weekend worrying about him, but it wasn't until Tuesday that I knew something was really wrong. The call came from the regional office, asking if I'd heard from Willie recently. He hadn't submitted any reports since the middle of the previous week, and they hadn't been able to reach him. My heart raced as I told them I hadn't heard anything, but promised I'd go by and check on him that afternoon, once I got back into town. Willie lived alone in a 2-story house on the east side, in a neighborhood that had declined over the years. But despite that, Willie's house was always well kept. He once told me that when his wife was alive, he had been lousy at maintaining the place. Too much like his job, he'd said. But after she passed, with no kids or grandkids to fill the silence, he had devoted his empty time to taking care of the home she had loved. When I arrived, I knocked twice, waited, then rang the doorbell. His car was in the driveway, but there was no answer. After hitting the doorbell again, I called out, "Willie? You in there? You sick or something?" Still no response. I stepped off the porch, unsure of what to do. Part of me didn't want to intrude, but I couldn't shake the fear that he might be inside, hurt or worse. My eyes landed on a rock by the flower bed, a rock that didn't quite look like a rock. Crouching down, I picked it up and gave a dry laugh. A hide-a-key. Sliding the bottom open, I found a house key nestled inside. Willie might get pissed, but better that than leaving him in trouble. I used the key, calling out that I was coming in as I unlocked the door. But when I started to push it open, I met resistance. I glanced up and froze. Willie's face was peering through the gap, red-eyed and wild. His skin gleamed with an unhealthy sheen, and his voice, when it came, was a raspy croak. "Get away," he muttered, barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my mind racing. Black marks in the shape of long fingers wrapped around his neck like a collar. Fear and anger surged through me. "Willie? What the hell happened? Did someone hurt you?" Tears welled in his eyes as he squeezed them shut. "No. Just get away from here, kid. Don't come back." With that, he stepped back and slammed the door shut before I could react. By the time I recovered enough to bang on the door, I could hear the deadbolt sliding into place, and no amount of yelling or knocking got any further response. I went home and called the police, asking them to do a welfare check. 2 hours later, they told me they'd spoken to Willie, and he was fine, just fighting off a bug that had him feeling cold all the time. They mentioned that he wasn't happy about his nosy coworker sending cops to check on him, and reminded me that 911 was for real emergencies. It was clear. I should leave Willie alone. And that's exactly what I did. Willie never came back to work after that. A few more weeks passed, and I quit the job too. The anxiety of stepping into new houses had gotten to me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the company let me go anyway. I didn't stop worrying about Willie because of what the cop said, or even because Willie told me to stay away. I tell myself that should have been reason enough, but deep down, I know better. Willie was a good guy and a friend, and I should go check on him again whether he wants me to or not. But whenever my guilt hits hardest, and I'm close to driving over to his place or giving him a call, something holds me back. It's the memory of that half-second glimpse into his house, the vivid image of what I saw, gently swaying behind him. A faded black rocking horse, its brown leather saddle polished to a high sheen. And between the seat and the stirrups, bright gold lettering so clear I could read it across the too thick gloom.